Well, many thanks to Tim for inviting me. May I ask first someone at the back whether you can hear me or not? Still loud, okay. Voice will probably give out, but I'll do my best. We are now in ancient Athenian conditions. Has anybody been to Athens? Yeah. Been up on the Pnyx, which is where they met in open assembly at one time every 9 days, so that there were referendums held every 9 days. And I'm introducing that notion, you can guess why. The Academy of Ideas, that's a very good start. Two ancient Greek words, academia, associated particularly with Plato, a rabid anti-democrat of the ancient sort of democracy, and I'll come on to that point shortly. Ideas, another Platonic word, sometimes in English translated forms. So the idea of the good is the ultimate goal at which we all should aspire in human communities. Ancient Greece is in the title. As you can see, perhaps in this gloom on your handout, it's a good thing I brought a handout. Of course, I brought a PowerPoint, but I believe everything has collapsed. So we are back to ancient Athenian conditions. And I am an honorary citizen of Sparta. And of course, the war between Sparta and Athens still goes on. Anyhow. Let me begin then with a little bit of autobiography in relation to my book, which was based on a series of lectures to my Part 2, both classics and history students, between 2009 and 2014. The book, quite coincidentally, came out first. It's been reissued with a new afterword. I'll explain why shortly. It came out originally in March, April 2016. In other words, slap bang in the middle of two rather disgusting and disgraceful democratic campaigns. One, the referendum in this country. Two, the presidential campaign on the other side of the Atlantic. And the period between the publication of my book and the general election of June 2017, which astonishingly to me, so many of us seem to have forgotten. Remember, Mrs. May called a general election on the question of mandate for a certain sort of procedure towards Brexit. She did not get it. And commentators astonishingly completely forget June 2017 and go back and back to June 2016. But at any rate, we can talk about that in discussion perhaps. So before my book came out, while I was writing it, the Scottish referendum, then the referendum of 2016 on EU, the Northern American USA presidential election, the June 2017 general election, represents the most concentrated period of democratic participatory activity on our, that is, I'm using it broadly, Western model of democracy in my adult lifetime. I was born in 1947. Therefore, I came of age, voting age, then, in 1968. So this is the 50th anniversary of my voting capacity. And as I say, those couple of years, and in particular 15 months, were the most concentrated. I'm a student of primarily ancient democracy, but I am interested in the notion as it has been transmitted across the ages down to the very present, when it's exceptionally widespread. A lot of societies, a lot of cultures, a lot of political entities call themselves democratic. One of the points of my book, and a rather unpleasant friend said perhaps it should have been called Democracy a Death, because we do seem to be teetering, don't we, on the brink in some ways. It's not the first time democracy would have died or been murdered. It happened in antiquity, it happened in the 20th century several times. But I am interested in it as a notion, and I have given you a handout of 10 points. And my main point is the one that emerges immediately at the very end. 2 lessons Lesson A, the past is a foreign country. And the point principally is this. All modern Western post-17th, 18th century liberal versions of democracy are indirect, representative, parliamentary, in principle. We have an odd sort of, what should we call it, mixed constitution, where something called the Crown has to sign off on legislation which has been passed by the two houses of Parliament. We still, nevertheless, require the royal assent. Some of you may have seen the wonderful play King Charles III. Anybody seen that? Where Charles refuses royal assent and thereby triggers a total constitutional crisis. Well, we, of course, don't need the Crown to trigger a constitutional crisis. At any rate, on the other hand, all versions of ancient demokratia, I use the Greek word, in its strongest original form, that is, not merely meaning not kingship, in other words, not meaning merely republic, which is actually what the word did come to mean, but when it meant, etymologically and pragmatically, people power, people force, people strength, they are all direct. And there's a very simple reason for that. Purely technologically, they were incapable of managing a complex system of representation. They didn't wish to manage such a system because they saw the people, that is, of course, the few, very few, empowered adult male citizen people who were free. They saw that as a strong, homogeneous entity which should have its hands directly on the levers of power. So any separation between us and them, the people and the executive, or even Parliament, would have been unacceptable. And very often forgotten that it's a bit of a paradox that all modern systems of democracy are, insofar as they function, and insofar as it's not merely a euphemism or just propaganda, liberal democracy of a Western kind, they are all indirect. So, if you have a look at your handout, the word demokratia is a portmanteau word. It's a combination of two other words, demos, kratos. Now, kratos is unambiguous, unambivalent, and of course it matters who holds it and to what purpose it is put. But it means, its meaning is transparent. Power, force, strength, might. Not, by the way, rule. I recently bought a little Usborne book. It's for children. Sub-adults, at any rate, and it's called For Beginners, and it's about politics. And demokratia in ancient Greek is mistranslated as rule of the people. No, there is another Greek word for rule, and it's archi, and it's the basis of monarchy, for example. So, at any rate, force, power, strength, might of the demos. The problem comes, and this is item 2, that demos is ambiguous, so it can mean more than one thing, and therefore ambivalent because people take different views of the value of the different things, and that therefore conditions the application of the force. Who is applying it to what and for what purpose? So I very anachronistically, I find this a useful pedagogical technique, given two modern analogies to the translation of the word demos, which is a very, very ancient Greek word. It goes all the way back to at least the 14th century BC or BCE, when it meant something like a village. And that usage survives right down into the classical period, 5th, 4th centuries BC, BCE. In Athens, a demos was, as well as people in some sense, a village, a parish, a ward, a local political entity through which you realized your status as an Athenian citizen. So no national register of citizens, local parish register, as it were. And there's a good reason for that. Typically, everyone would know who everybody else was. What you're trying to prevent is illegitimate usurpation of citizen privileges. So you've got to have proof that the young man of 18 who is being introduced to his demos, his dean, is indeed the person that the introducer says he is. Legitimately born to this father, this mother, this father, and this mother, both being Athenian citizens, and this boy, about to become a man, aged 18, is indeed who everyone says he is. And you swear an oath in the name of the gods. So if you're lying, it's not just your fellow citizens who are going to punish you, it's the gods who are going to punish you. And that's going to be pretty nasty. Gods, plural. We're in a polytheistic world. There is one chief god of Athens. She is Athena. She's female, well, vaguely female. She's a virgin, a warrior. She's not terribly feminine, but she is the chief god of the Athenian city. So now, this is where the problem arises. Suppose you're Lincoln at Gettysburg in 1863, and you deliver a funeral oration, and you refer to the Constitution of the United States as being government of the people, by the people, for the people. And then you think a little bit, which exactly people actually governed? So in other words, people is being used in this wonderfully all-embracing, loose, vague sense. Very few female people had any part in governing. Very few black people had any part in governing the United States in 1860. So that's it, the all-embracing, all-inclusive sense. But there is an exclusive sense as well. Because the ancient Greeks were more upfront than we are about socio-economic matters and how society and economy cashes out in political terms. The greatest analyst of ancient Greek politics, Aristotle, made it the fundamental principle of his analysis of all political constitutions, whether or not you were rich or you were poor. If you're rich, you don't have to work and you're able to make others work for you. If you're poor, you have to work. You may not be destitute, but you have to work. And your relationship to the means of production is crucially qualitatively, not merely quantitatively different. And so for him, for Aristotle, who analysed lots of different kinds of democracy, grades if you like, all democracies had one thing in common: they were the rule of the poor, the masses. And this is the other meaning of demos. The people as a whole, you might say, the Athenians, or the mass of the poor citizenry of the Athenian citizen body. And that's why I use the analogy, which ultimately goes back to Karl Marx via Lenin, namely dictatorship of the proletariat. Because imagine you're one of the rich, you're one of the elite, you're one of the few. These are all, in a way, synonyms. To you, the rule of the masses, for the masses, by the masses, could well be seen as rule against or over you. So not a nice, pleasant thing, but actually a way of keeping the rich in their place. And I think probably that is the most extraordinary thing about ancient Greek democracy, that it is the one, I think one of the very few ever systems, where though rich people might throw in their lot, for example, Pericles was stinking rich, but he was also an ideological democrat, so he threw in his lot with the masses. It's one of the very few occasions where the masses institutionally, collectively enjoyed superior power over their elite, in other ways, superiors, better educated, more leisure, wealthier, of course. The rich are different. Yes, they're richer, and so on. Jesus said, the poor we always have with us. Yes, we do, but very few times are they empowered poor. So I've already used, we're moving on to section 3, lots of words with ultimately an ancient Greek derivation. And most of our English political, whether theoretical or pragmatic vocab, is of ancient Greek and or, because sometimes they're loan words, Latin derivation. So I have put in the handout here what's really a selection. It's a good selection, but politics, our word, comes ultimately from a Greek word polis, which doesn't mean any old city or city-state, but a particular form of political entity. I call it a citizen state. So the Athenians never referred to Athens did this, Sparta did this. The Athenians did this. The Spartans, meaning the concrete body of citizens who were empowered to take decisions and act in the name of the city as a whole. Aristotle thought that we humans are political animals, but that doesn't mean we're all animals and we all do politics. He meant we are animals by nature, we're organically constituted entities, the goal of whose social collective life is to live in the best form of political community, namely the polis. So it's a very it's a judgmental statement. It's not a scientifically descriptive statement to call man, that is humankind, a political animal. So, going through anarchy, I've already mentioned the archy word. An means not archy. So anarchy is not having any rules or rulers. Aristocracy. The crassy is the same bit, kratos, as in democracy, and aristo means best. Well, they thought they were the best, meaning richest, best born, best educated, and ideally smartest, but it doesn't always go together. Dynasty or dynasty, Greek word meaning power, literally capacity, that which you can do and get away with. Dunamis, dynamic, is from the same root as dynasty, dynasty. Monarchy, rule of a sole person, monos, archy. Oligarchy, rule of oligoi, the few, and because the few were typically rich, it's the rule of the rich. So it's the antonym, the antithesis of democracy, oligarchy. Plutocracy, well, that's just a variation on rule of the rich. Plutos means wealth. And tyranny, a loan word into Greek from probably Lydian, to represent the seizure of power or the holding of power by a monarch based on force, not on law. And then we move on. In Latin, we have the following. Citizens from civis. Constitution, literally a standing together thing. Empire, imperium, a form of force. Some of you may have seen Robert Harris's Imperium or read his novel Imperium. It's a very strong form of power. The Greeks had no equivalent to it, and it's where our word empire comes from, of course. Liberal from free, republican, two Latin words, res and publicus, the thing of the people, and I'm going to come back briefly to people. State is from the same as constitution, same root, standing together, a status, and then we have also one or two others there that I'm trying to find. Yes, power from potestas in modern Italian. A podesta is a mayor, and that's exactly the ancient Latin word potestas. Capacity, it's the Latin equivalent of dunamis in Greek. And people from populus. Right. Well, one of the buzzwords of this conference, and indeed of the Brexit campaign, and indeed of many, many entities, political entities in Europe today, is popular sovereignty. Sovereignty comes into English from French, from originally a vulgar Latin word, superanus. You've got to be very careful how you say that word, which then gets corrupted to souverain in French and sovereignty, and then into English. People, populus. Well, the Romans were very clear that populus equals demos in Greek, in the same sense of the citizen body. So the populus Romanus is everybody who is a civis, all added together. That is the people, i.e. not the entirety of the 6 million population of the Roman Empire. It's specifically that very small minority who are the citizens of Rome. And the same was the case in Athens, for example. I estimate that citizens constituted something like 15% only of the total population of the territory of the polis of the Athenians. The Greeks were very well aware of the issue of ultimate authority, shall we say, another word, of course, from Latin. But those of you who know the Greek Mass, or indeed know the Latin Mass, Kyrie eleison, the Lord, God, is kurios. And so that's an adjective, kurios, and there is a noun phrase, to kurion, which means the ultimate authoritative power. And the Athenians were in no doubt where that resided. It resided with the demos, and it resided with the demos when it made decisions in its decision-making forums. I've mentioned the pnyx. It's a widespread misapprehension, not surprising, but that politics happened typically only on the pnyx hill. In other words, that when the Athenians took a decision, that happened on the pnyx in open assembly, which might happen, as I said, every 9 days. The assembly's agenda always had certain fixed items on it, but there would then be special measures brought forward ad hoc, depending on the external and internal situation. Well, that assembly made a decision, but Athenians also, as citizens, might put themselves forward, beginning of each civil year, to be empaneled on a panel of 6,000, I'm going to call them justices, because though we usually translate them jurors, they were also judges. And they voted, not in open voting, as on the pnyx, but secret ballot. And juries might be as big as 6,000, which is the entirety of the panel, but more normally would be of the order of 501 to avoid a tie. For example, the trial of Socrates. Now, we distinguish, we separate off the executive, the legislative, and the judiciary. And we, or at least I hope everyone here, there is a certain newspaper that doesn't quite understand the concept of an independent judiciary. But at any rate, the Athenians would have had no truck with that, because if you're qualified to make the decision, let's say X is going to be the policy of the state or the law of the state, then you also have the right to sit in judgment on it, to test it, to see whether it was a good decision in the assembly. And that's how Athenian politics worked. There was checks and balances, but not of people, not of distinct functions, but of distinct ideas of what it is to make a decision. On the one hand in the assembly, on the other hand in the law courts. Enough, therefore, about vocabulary. And I've already introduced a number of the key institutional differences, at least I hope they're becoming clear, between our way of thinking about and doing our versions of Western liberal democracy and their direct, ancient mass rule by mass meeting on the assembly and then revising, as it were, in individual trials of both individuals and of principles. There were many, many ancient Greek cities. Aristotle and his pupils managed to cobble together accounts of the constitutions of about 160 of them, which is about 1/6, because there were about 1,000. There's no such thing as ancient Greece, in other words, as a political entity. There are lots and lots of Greeks. They live round the Mediterranean, round the Black Sea, and they are Greek because they speak Greek. They observe certain Greek customs, such as monogamy, and they have myths in common whereby they believe they're all ultimately descended from common ancestors, ultimately going back to the gods. So they're, on the one hand, a strong cultural entity which celebrate, for example, the Olympic Games and other pan-Hellenic, all Greek festivals. On the other hand, they're radically divided amongst themselves, against themselves. They're constantly fighting each other. Athenians were at war, on average, 2 years in every 3 in the 5th and 4th centuries BC. So the issue of peace and war was that sort of issue that constantly kept coming up before the assembly. Now, what's our evidence? Well, I've mentioned Aristotle. He was one of the more moderate or anti-democrats. If that surprises you, it shouldn't. Given what I've said about democracy of the ancient Greek kind in its original form being direct rule of the masses, both over the state and over the elite. All our writers, such as Aristotle, who actually was not even a citizen of the city he spent most of his adult life in, that is Athens, he was a citizen of places elsewhere. He couldn't therefore participate in democratic politics, even if he'd wanted to. He had a research institute which studied democracy very effectually. So we have, in Athens, we have Aristotle's products, and we have just one of those 160 constitutions surviving, and of course it's the Athenian one, which is quite useful because it teaches us that Athens didn't just have one democracy, it had 3 different kinds sequentially. So there's no such thing as ancient Athenian democracy. As such, there are different versions at different times. Why were most anti-democratic? Because they thought it represented the worst, as they put it in ethical terms, ruling over the best, or the better at any rate. The stupid, the ignorant, the fickle, the ill-educated, en masse, deciding stuff at the expense of, not for the benefit of, the elite few intellectual, or at least smarter and better educated and certainly more leisured and wealthy and so on individuals. I've mentioned Plato, very, very hostile. Aristotle saw some virtue in some aspects of democracy, therefore he's less hostile. He was Plato's most brilliant pupil. But most of the writers that we have are hostile to a greater or lesser extent, and the number of known pro-democratic intellectuals, that's to say people who wrote stuff about democracy, you can count them on the fingers of one hand. The earliest exponent of a theory of democracy as distinct from any other form of political constitution is actually a non-Athenian, and it's not absolutely clear what his own political outlook was, exactly where he would have put his finger along the spectrum of democratic practices, and this is Herodotus. I wouldn't be standing here but for Herodotus. Herodotus is my patron saint. He is the founding father of my discipline of history. And in its original sense, history meant inquiry, critical inquiry, not propaganda, non-propaganda, anti-propaganda. So he presents the arguments in favor of, on the one hand, rule by the masses, on the other hand, rule by a few elite aristocrats, as opposed to, thirdly, rule by one, either hereditary or in other way empowered monarch. And there are three qualities which the speaker in favour of a version of democracy utters. It's in Book 3, chapters 80 to 82 of Herodotus. And they are that the masses, all in all, it's a sort of Aristotelian wisdom of the crowds argument. Everybody should have a say, and therefore, since democracy is the version of political decision-making which gives most people the most say, it is therefore superior to any other form of decision-making. Secondly, all officials, that's to say, you've got to have people doing magistrates and other kinds of political business, allocating public funds, holding trials and so on. They should all be appointed by lot. We think that free and fair elections are the most democratic way of choosing our representatives. The ancient Greek democrats thought elections were non- or anti-democratic because they favoured the elite. The Latin word nobilis gives us our noble. Greek had an exactly parallel word. It meant best known. And you're best known because you're rich, because you're from a particular family, because you've afford the time to stand up in public, to go in for political career. So that is, in the view of the masses, the ordinary Athenians, elitist in a bad way. And then everybody, however selected to an office, whether by lot or, and they did have some elections, for generals, for example, you don't want the lot to choose who's governing your army or navy at a particular moment. Not that the generals and admirals were necessarily all brilliant, but at any rate, you're more likely to get someone vaguely competent than if it's just anybody. Anyway, however chosen by election or by lot, they must all be subject to recall. The Greek word means subject to audit. An audit is carried out by the people through either the courts or through a subcommittee of, now this is in a way the kingpin of the Athenian system, the Council of 500. Every year a new council came into being, 500, representing geographically the regions into which the city-state of Athens was divided, 50 per each 10 unit. There were 10 units, we call them tribes. Each one provided 50. They sat in council in the middle of Athens, underneath the Pnyx, pretty much every day of the year. They slept, some of them, 50 of them at a time, overnight, in case there was an overnight emergency. They were paid, or they were given a little bit of expenses. It was a public duty, and pretty much every Athenian probably would have to do that once in their lifetime. In other words, govern the country for a year. It's quite an extraordinary phenomenon. That partly explains how the Athenians managed different versions of democracy for almost 200 years, between about 500 and about 320. Moving on then, we can probably cut the item 7 because that's my point. If you flip over your handout, like us, the ancients thought that democracy should have two fundamental principles. How you enact the principles, that's of course a different matter. And they are freedom and equality. So as I put on the handout under item 8, mostly ancient Athenian democrats were radical egalitarians. That's why one citizen, one vote. No one shall count for more than one, regardless of height, birth, smartness, anything like that. One vote, one citizen. Everybody is radically, numerically equal. Votes were counted, as I've said, or sometimes told in the assembly to save time. In the law courts, they were always counted, a secret ballot. And this is in the most striking contrast to, if you like, my own Sparta, which did not have the notion of equal counting of votes in public assembly because they shouted rather than raised their right hands. And so if you're a 6'6" stentor, you're going to have maybe even 3 times as much weight to your shout as to a relatively normal-sized guy. So Sparta also had kings. Well, that was deeply shocking. One part of being a good Greek republican was, of course, to get rid of these terribly old-fashioned things called kings. Okay, in Homer's day, but we've moved on since there. The Spartans did move on, but only in the sense that they had 2 kings, not 1, so that each one was meant to act as a kind of check on the other. But nevertheless, they gave them immense respect, a kind of charismatic authority, which the Athenians would have considered to be raising humans above the level of humans. Deeply shocking, actually, to Athenian way of thinking. But, this is item 9, in one respect, no ancient Greek democrat, that is, adult male citizen with democratic empowerment and thinking a bit about what it was to be a democrat, was an egalitarian on gender. Aristotle, among his, he made several mistakes, but the worst, to my view, was his view that all women, by their nature, that is, unchangeably at birth, are not just different from all males, but inferior to them. And therefore, this was his justification for their disempowerment. Aristotle was one of those who felt you have to justify, explain every actually existing phenomenon, whether in the natural or in the human world, especially those which seem to function well. So why was it that women were not empowered within the framework of the because they're naturally inferior. Well, most Athenian democrats, I believe, had a sort of common sense, ordinary man's version of that Aristotelian high philosophical theory, i.e., I am a man and you are merely a woman. And they treated women extremely, we would say, differentially. And Athenian women were unable, for example, to own property to any significant extent. They certainly had no vote. They had little or no say in whom they married. Their husband was there, or their nearest male relative, their father, maybe their uncle, was their not just guardian, but really their owner. They didn't have an independent legal personality whatsoever. They were treated as if they were underage, even if they happened to be 75 and a great-grandmother. They were still, in Athenian legal terms, underage. And there is a Spartan joke, and I've put it on the handout here. These are made up. They're probably made up by Athenians, actually. But at any rate, an Athenian and a Spartan meet, and that must mean outside either Athens or Sparta. So let's say it's Olympia. And the Athenian, very democratic, says, you Spartans, why don't you have, like we have, a good democracy in your state? And the Spartan replies, well, we will introduce democracy into our state when you Athenians introduce democracy into your own homes. In other words, the Athenians' home was not just his castle, but his prison, really. This was his domain, his fiefdom. And of course, the poorer you are, the lower you are down the scale, the closer to servitude, for example, the more you're going to insist on your masculine rights. And the Greek word for courage, bravery, means literally masculinity, virility. And in a state which fought so often, which was at war so often, to be a male and therefore to be able to be courageous, masculine, virile, this was all terribly important. Well, I mentioned that the word democracy still exists in huge quantity around the place. When I was growing up and very politically active in the 60s, there were the people's democracies of the Soviet bloc. There was, of course, the Chinese people's democracy, and there were all the rest of our Western democracies. There are, I believe, even more now than there were back in the 1960s, formally, technically speaking. Go back to the 60s, German Democratic Republic, Deutsche Demokratische Republik. Well, enough said. The word demokratia was depreciated also in the ancient world. So it's not a new phenomenon that this word, which potentially is very empowering and therefore very threatening, can also be watered down so that it becomes merely a buzzword, merely a nice soporific propaganda label. Well, in the ancient world, broadly speaking, there are three moments, very, very long run. One, when radical, direct, people power, mass democracy was knocked on the head by Alexander the Great, above all, in the end of the 4th century. The Greek world became carved up into large territorial monarchies. And it became a badge of honor for those formerly more or less independent Greek cities to register that they were not directly ruled by one of these kings in Egypt or in Greece or in what's now Turkey. And so they used the word demokratia to mean not having a king ourselves and not being directly ruled by a monarch from outside. So it comes to mean something approximating the use of republic in its negative sense, i.e. not monarchy, not subordinated. It then took a further dive when the Roman Empire split in the 4th century of our era, such that we talk about early Byzantium. So the Eastern Roman Empire becomes early Byzantium. The Western Roman Empire is the Western Roman Empire. And Constantine the Great, was a Catholic Orthodox Christian who wasn't ashamed to impose his views on everybody else. And he instituted a theocracy, a theocratia of an Orthodox Catholic kind. Democratia, therefore, becomes even further removed because you've got now the separation between a secular and a sacred domain in an antagonistic sense. What matters is the sacred domain, very sharply differentiated from the human secular one. And in the 6th century of our era, that's the era of Justinian, 527 to 565, a contemporary chronicler, he's describing a riot that takes place in the hippodrome, the horse race course, in what was then Constantinople, today Istanbul. And he uses the word for riot, demokratia. So far have we gone from the earliest positive sense of the term to a sense in which it's nothing better than mob, disorderly, chaotic behavior. Nothing to do with politics as such, and it's wholly negative. And so, to conclude, the past is a foreign country. They did things very differently from us, though we use the same name. And part of my book, the last part of it, is trying to account for, or describe mainly, why the word democracy, having been at a discount for a millennium or more, gradually creeps back up the scale until it becomes universally acceptable because it is so deprived of very strong political content, such that, as I say, we're all Democrats now. If you have been, and if you've heard me, thank you for listening.